be prepared to challenge yourself and be prepared to talk to people who will challenge you on that vision.
You are talking to how many founders?
Over the past 2.5 years,
Right.
it's just over 600.
How do you
startups.
differentiate between a good founder and an okay founder?
Every founder is on the path to becoming a great founder. Unsuccessful startup is one step closer to your successful startup. There's a number of different traits of good founders. One of them is...
Hi, and welcome to a new episode of Entrepreneurs Insights, the podcast series that helps entrepreneurs, founders to navigate their way to success. We have a great guest today, but we also have a great co-host. Hello, Vishal. How are you doing?
Good morning, William. I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Good. And Terence, good to meet you.
You want to tell us a bit more about yourself?
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you for the invite to come and speak. So I'm Terence. I'm an immunologist, primary care physician by training. I trained in the NHS. Moved back to Singapore quite a number of years ago. I had quite a number of my own businesses, small, medium enterprises that I exited from. About 6-7 years ago, I got involved in clinical AI. So I was working with Babylon Health, and then I was medical director for the global team for Ubie, which was at that time a mid-stage startup, and now they're of course quite big and scaling globally. And then 2.5 years ago, I joined a big technology company to help them with the healthcare life sciences startups.
Yeah. And this is how I get to know you. You are organizing a lot of events. I don't know when you have time to see your family or do anything else. You are all about business, man. This is amazing. And you are organizing all these events in Singapore, but also in other cities around the world. Is that right?
Yes. So one of the things that happened was quite by accident. I founded Tech Brews, which is a pro bono, open innovation community. It's mostly centered around healthcare and life sciences. It's a bit of fintech going on as well. And we have regular meetups.
Yeah.
So, and it's scaled across countries. So we have it in Singapore, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, San Francisco, Tokyo, Johannesburg. And I'm super excited because the first London meet is happening later this month.
Wow.
One of the things that is very common between a lot of entrepreneurs is not how many successful businesses they have built, but also how many potentially unsuccessful businesses they have been part of. Because you learn so much from unsuccessful businesses that can be translated into successful outcomes, right?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about what were the key pointers that you learned from your unsuccessful business.
I think the main thing that I learned was you have to be optimistic, but you have to plan for the worst.
Right.
So in that particular startup, one of the mistakes that was made, and I freely admit I was part of the mistake fully, is we didn't envisage a scenario whereby the founders couldn't agree, or the founders couldn't disagree so badly on certain points that it got into a stage where we're talking about, hey, what happens next? Because there doesn't seem to be a way forward.
Yeah.
And traditionally, one might think, okay, you have 3 co-founders, so it's an odd number, 2 versus 1, you can move forward. But it can be such a fundamental issue that there is no way forward and there's no off-ramp.
Okay.
So one of the things that I'm very keen on sort of advising, particularly first-time founders, is talk to founders who've had, like you said, the not successful exits, learn from them and build in the off-ramps so that you can still exit, and at the end of the day, it's not going to be a massive fallout for your investors, for your shareholders, and for the founders as well. Yeah. There are things that you want to do right, but a lot of the time, avoiding doing the wrong thing is just as powerful as doing the right thing.
Yeah.
But if you look at a startup stage, and if we divide it, roughly speaking, into the 3 stages, 0 to 1, which is mostly your MVP and your development stage, the 1 to 10, which is the product market fit stage, and then the 10 to 100, which is the scaling stage. I find the 0 to 1 is predominantly don't make the mistake, as opposed to you don't necessarily need to do it totally correct, but you just need to avoid the mistake. So avoid the mistake of not talking to stakeholders. avoid the mistake of not talking to the subject matter experts, for example, not getting the right, for example, the clinical advisors on board to say, actually, this does or doesn't fit into a clinical workflow. And then on the other end of the scale, in order for you to, literally scale that 10 to 100, you have to be doing things correct.
Right.
Not doing the wrong thing is not good enough at that stage.
Yeah.
And the trickiest stage, naturally, is the 1 to 10 product market fit, because you have to do both the right thing and not to do the wrong thing.
Before you scale 10 to 100.
Before you scale and have to do totally the right thing.
Yeah.
And so in each stage, there's lots and lots of little valleys of death.
Correct.
That I think startups have to overcome. It's more marked in healthcare and life sciences. Life sciences is very famous for having that valley of death because it's such a long incubation period. Lots of capital goes in. But healthcare as well, because particularly in healthcare, there's a lot of stakeholders. And it's not always clear who has the final procurement say. We tend to lump healthcare and life sciences maybe a bit too close together. They're actually fairly separate industries naturally.
Right.
But when it comes to startups, I think of healthcare and life science startups a little bit differently.
Right.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll dissect that a little bit. So healthcare startups tend to be, by very nature, they tend to be local businesses because healthcare is a local industry and a local business. Healthcare startups tend to be gaps-based. So it takes too long for me to get an appointment. I'm going to have an appointment application. Or I can't find a doctor in time. I'll do a telemedicine application. That tends to be the trend. There are exceptions to the rule where there's some more infrastructure platform plays like health records play in healthcare. But healthcare, to my mind, tends to be a little bit more local, a little bit more gap space. Life sciences tends to be, by its very nature, more of a regional, if not global business, because the medicine, the device, the diagnostic tool is, you're aiming for the global market by and large.
Right.
And it's also capabilities based.
Right.
So if you think about it, if you're a genomic startup, you really want to be in a country where there's readily available sequences, where your data scientists and your genomic scientists are well trained and you have access to quite a number of them. So if we go back to healthcare, I think one of the core things that I spend quite a lot of time talking to founders about is how do you envisage your business? And I'll give you an example of this. So if you say, I want to do, and let's be a bit facile here, a telemedicine business in Singapore. By and large, that population is max 6 million on a good day, soaking wet, right? On a bad day, it's maybe 4, 4.5. And so naturally, you're confined to that market scale.
Sure.
And therefore, you can be a startup, but how big can your startup be? Can you shoot for that unicorn? If you're just limited to Singapore, you may want to think twice about that. But on the other hand, I don't want to discourage founders from doing things that have a good impact. And so it's really a case of you can be a startup, but be sort of clear-eyed around what your scale is, how you see it scaling. And if you're satisfied with that, perfect, wonderful. If you're not satisfied with that, I don't necessarily think you need to throw that out the window. So you can say, hey, going back to telemedicine, well, let's look at the regulations in Indonesia. Let's look at the regulations in Malaysia. Let's see, can we provide it now at a wider scale? Can we, instead of looking primary care, look at secondary care, specialist care?
Right.
And so I think that a lot of founders come into the ecosystem in healthcare saying there's a gap and I'm going to fill the gap. And a lot of us are, and some of the more experienced folks, including myself, saying, well, how big is that gap? And does that gap exist anywhere else? If the gap exists somewhere else, fantastic. You don't have a good health record system, for example. Great. You can definitely scale it.
Right.
But I think to come in and to say, oh, we're going to be a unicorn on the basis of what is really quite a narrow gap. I think that is not great for the founders, it's not great for the investors, not great for the ecosystem.
Yeah.
How important is narrative and story building for founders?
It is very important to clearly articulate what is the problem and what is the problem that you're solving.
Yeah.
So being part of quite a number of competitions, demo days, etc., sometimes you can see in the audience, especially the investors, especially the partners, 3 sentences in, and they kind of get a sense of, actually, we don't know what this is about.
Yeah.
Right.
Or, yes, I'm going straight away into this. In my mind, a clear divide between B2B, B2C, and B2G. Mm-hmm. So that's business to business, business consumer, and business to government. Mm. So you can roughly position most startups into this space. Unfortunately, fortunately, actually, there will be startups that cut across. And that's good for them because it means that their solution can cross between different business models, right? The B2C space is notoriously difficult. And that's primarily driven by cost of customer acquisition. Your traditional clinic has actually not a massively high cost of customer acquisition, largely because that cost has been subsumed into the rental cost. Because if I have a very good clinic that sits in the intersection of Toa Payoh Central, I'm going to have footfall and people are going to come in one way or the other. But if you're a digital enterprise, now getting people's attention is particularly difficult.
Right.
And so the cost of customer acquisition on B2C businesses, I think, is a very key metric and something that most founders should really think very hard about. And some founders have solved it beautifully. One of the obvious, but still elegant and beautiful solutions is the B2B to C route, where you essentially have channel partnerships with other businesses. Right. And that's a nice segue into the B2B space. B2B space startups in Singapore have a little bit of an advantage in the ASEAN region because there's a lot of regional hubs in Singapore. So there's regional innovation hubs. We've seen that with big pharma and big device companies. There's even just big pharma have relocated a number of their regional teams to Singapore as well. Diving a little bit deeper into that, there is still a lot of alignment that these big multinationals need with their home base. So one of the things that we've seen with startups is they speak to the regional teams, or at least previously, they would speak to regional teams, love it, but they have to go back to North America or to Switzerland or to Europe.
Oh, absolutely.
And
to get the global guys buying as
well. And
they
need to get the global guys, but not just the finance, but the technology side, the integration side, compliance. I'm happy to see it changing somewhat. So I'm happy to see some organizations say, well, you know what? Let's just do the pilot locally. I'll make a decision. The risk is not high. We can work on the mothership concurrently, but there's no reason why we can't do
the pilot.
At least a pilot, right?
Okay. That's good because that's not something that I see that often. So I mean, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Please carry on. But good.
But I mean, I hear it more. Like previously, it was rare.
That's good.
Now I hear it a little bit more. But that, of course, comes into plays into the death by pilotitis.
Yes.
Right. So you just have a whole series of pilots and nothing paid, and it's very difficult sometimes with the multinationals to front load that adoption discussion.
Right.
So
actually, when you say something like this, what really comes to my mind, I like the word pilotitis, by the way, because how many pilots you can keep on doing and as a startup, you're draining resources.
Absolutely.
You are talking to how many founders? Close to 600, you said?
Yeah. So over the past 2.5 years-ish, I've spoken to just over 600.
Right. How do you
startups.
differentiate
crazy.
between a good founder and let's use a term an okay founder that might make or might not make it? So that's my first question. And the second question that comes to my mind on the concept of the pilotitis, do you think that the pilots that a lot of pharma companies and other big companies, that a lot of the founders end up going to them for validation? That's the validation, right? Pilots is effectively validation.
Yeah.
They can take it to venture capital funds and say, hey, we are working with someone. Do you think that pilot or pilotitis is helping bridge the gap of innovation at a global level and in Asia?
Okay, last in, first out.
Yeah.
So yes, in some respects, you do see the pilots being used as validation, as a commercial validation tool, mostly in the PMF stage. The problem with that is they tend to be fairly small scale,
Right.
and it's really anecdotal.
And very little money for the founders to even sustain, right?
Absolutely. And you sometimes one has to question the true validation value of the pilot.
Yeah.
If it's small, not much there,
Correct.
very controlled environment, how will it do in the real world when it's released into the wild? Not entirely
Correct.
clear.
Yeah.
But it does bridge the gap. There is definitely a space for it. So as much as I say pilotitis and everything, I think that's really based on the fact that if you're doing 50 pilots, no payment, that's pilotitis.
That's pilot.
If you're doing 5 with big global pharma at a reasonable scale, that is not pilotitis.
Yeah.
That is good business sense.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think on the subject of the sort of global innovation, adoption, and validation, I think what we're beginning to see is the startups taking a little bit more of a permissive approach.
Right.
Actually, both the big companies and the startups take a little bit more of a permissive approach to say, hey, it may be a product market fit motion, but there's actually a little bit of a co-development motion as well. So, and that's not unfair because many of these products will have a degree of customization for each customer, for each pilot. And so when it feeds back, what you now are seeing is you're seeing papers, you're seeing white papers, if not academic papers come up. I think the most one of the bigger ones was the use of ambient AI scribes. And I think, please correct me if I'm wrong to the audience, Permanente Group published that study with one of the ambient AI companies. So it has its role to play. It does foster that innovative spirit. I think the question for everybody is, what's next?
Right.
Some of them go on to be widely adopted, and that is perfect. But I think the real question is, how can we increase that? How can we make that less? How can we improve the return on investment on that pilot for all parties involved?
Right. Is there
Eventually-
one trait that you pick from some founders?
One of the things that I've seen, because I work for small companies who became big, or some that were small and never made it to become big, is also the critical importance for the founder to be capable to evolve and adjust, because the recipe that was working to run the show when it was 3 of you in a boardroom is not the same recipe that you need to have as a leader. When you manage 30 people, 50, you need to delegate, to trust, to empower the right people. So me interviewing quite a number of these guys who have ended up running big companies, I always see that trait, that they are not only having a fantastic idea 20 years ago, but they have been able to at some point let go and know that their job is no longer to be in the weeds and know how to build a product, but
600 founders.
So 600 founders. So the first thing is, I don't think that there is an okay founder. I think that every founder is on the path to becoming a great founder. And sometimes we do see founders that, for whatever reason, the startup doesn't succeed. And my advice is always, it's a little bit, and I apologize for the analogy, but it's a little bit like quitting smoking. Most people don't succeed to quit smoking on the first try. But every try is a step towards the success. So it doesn't matter if your current startup doesn't succeed. You are on the path that unsuccessful startup is one step closer to your successful startup. And having put that into perspective, I think when we look at good founders, there's a number of different traits of good founders. One of them is, like Guillaume said, the ability to know when to let go. And that can mean several things. That can mean I'm now not going to mess with the code because I need to handle the board, my investors, and I need to schmooze with CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, for example, to make the sales. On the other hand, you've got really great founders who say, I can't do that. So I'm going to get somebody who can. And so the ability for another part of yourself to take over or for somebody else to take over is one trait for sure. Interestingly, and I can quote some data as well, but I do agree with the Kellogg study. I think it's Kellogg that came up with a study that said founders above a certain age tend to be more successful. The age tend to be 40 and above.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So the statistics.
Close one. That was a good one.
I know exactly what you mean.
Well, good.
Yeah, we're in that club. Anyway.
So the likelihood to exit, the higher valuations, it all comes. And when I say this, a lot of people, oh, you're being ageist against young people. I mean, if you look at it logically, because they often have a lot more networks. They're often more senior. They've often been in the industry for much longer, so they can many of the things come to mind. They've essentially gone through the Dunning-Kruger curve at big corporations. But I think that a lot of people miss the point when they say, oh, you're being ageist, you don't like young founders. Well, it's a team.
Yeah.
You have a founding team. So you absolutely need the younger generations in the team just as much as you need the older generations in the team. I think it's when you have absence of that diversity, that's when probably you get a bit of group thinking, or the likelihood of group thinking increases, and that increases the likelihood of doing something wrong.
Yeah. I have a perspective on that, which I'll share with you from my personal experience. The Kellogg study that you are referring to, it definitely might be true, partly because people have already been through that journey. That's definitely there. But what does not replace with young founders is the vision. And I genuinely think that young founders, they have the liberty of thinking so big versus somebody who is in their, after doing a stint in big enterprise, they're moving it into something. They have this caginess in their mindset. But
Great point.
Can we really do something about this? But I've been there, nobody does it, and so on, right? Versus a young founder, the good thing is they have never been through that. And so they can dare to really dream, and they can dare to make mistakes. And a good trait of an entrepreneur is somebody who can make mistakes, right? And I'm sure you will agree with me on that. But
100%.
That's the one thing that really excites me about young founders, to have that freedom to think, and it's okay to fail kind of mindset as well. So there's just a perspective that I have, right?
For sure.
It's actually so cool to think about it that way.
For sure. And I think having, in inverted commas, the marriage of having that big vision, out the box thinking, along with pragmatism and maybe a little bit of cynicism.
Yes.
I mean, I think when you combine it, it becomes very powerful.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? Because then you maybe have the best of both worlds inside there. But maybe one point to discuss, if you don't mind, is when you look at the younger, more visionary founders, they're taking big swings.
Yes.
And obviously with big swings come big misses, but also big hits.
Yeah.
But do you think that the macroeconomic situation, environment fosters the big hitters, the big swingers, excuse me?
The big hits and the misses, it's often related to the founder and the co-founder. Yeah. For an enterprise or a startup, if it's a single founder company, you often see that this one individual person making the big hits and big swings. But I'm a big believer that if you want to become successful, you got to have a co-founder, because then the other person becomes a yin and yang for you to kind of balance it out properly, right? So
that's the balance you were talking about as well. When earlier you were kind of creating this in the aggregate, you were designing this this ideal persona of both experience and yet visionary and a bit cynical and so on. I agree. But to the point around young founders who are really very bold and who want to go for this big swing. To your initial question, I have the impression that there is clearly overall the last years more emphasis on this. You talked about unicorn 3 times already in the first 10 minutes of this podcast. I mean, realistically, how many folks that you have met out of the 600 will ever become a unicorn and sell it? The chances are pretty slim. And yet a lot of folks, I mean, don't get me wrong, when you start a business, you are not starting it thinking, oh, if I am able to pay my rent, that's good enough, right? you want to make a big hit. But I think there's this narrative that you always need to go faster, you always need to go to raise more money, and you need to become that big huge thing in 5 years. I mean, most of the companies, to be successful, they need more time than that.
And I think it's important, particularly for the newer founders, that you have to define your own success.
Yeah.
So your own personal definition of success. I think most people, when you go to them privately and say, hey, if you had a startup and you had $100 million exit and you got 10% of that, do you think that would be, that would be great?
Yeah.
And then publicly, no, we have to.
Sad.
We got to go to the moon, right? We have to hit unicorn. But I think that's okay to a certain extent. It's good to have ambition, but I think it's also good to sort of sit back and have a personal view, your own view of what you view your own success as, and hold to that a little bit, right? You can change it as time goes on, but you should at least hold on to that. Say, well, actually, it's 10 million. Pretty good, right?
And it's partly to do with, you exactly hit the nail on its head. It's the personal definition, but it's partly to do with the fact that when you're starting something, you don't build a company to become a unicorn. You build a company to solve a problem. Right? And if you don't lose focus on that core problem, that's where you're going to be successful. Because at the end of the day, what is entrepreneurship? What is business building? What is creating a new business? You are creating a solution for something that does not exist, for a problem that exists, but a solution does not exist. So if you keep focusing on that solution, then generally, based on the size of the problem, you will have an exit, right? So I'm sure every venture capital fund, every angel investor, everyone, or even a buyer does that analysis when they want to buy or when they want to sell, right? Is the target market that you go for.
But also, I think something else to consider is when you mentioned, you have the problem and you're focused on it, it's actually quite a number of startups pivot to something much more successful along the way. And that's not necessarily saying that you got the problem wrong, but along the course of your minimum viable product or your product market fit stage, you've actually discovered, hang on, this thing is actually much, much better. And I can make a much bigger difference. Right? So the example that I use, telemedicine and people with disability, you suddenly realize actually they need matching services, they need home care, and you pivot towards that, and you're solving a much bigger solution. And so I think whilst holding fast to your vision is important, being agile enough within a certain set of boundaries in order to be open to discovering new problems and new markets and new solutions is very, very important.
No.
I would say being passionate about what difference you want to make should be core within that journey, but be prepared to challenge yourself and be prepared to talk to people who will challenge you on that vision and to add to your knowledge of it. Something that maybe concerns me now, and I think it's important for startup founders to consider, particularly in this climate, is funding and exits. So in Singapore, in this region, relatively speaking, exits are not that common. You compare this to our neighbors in India, vibrant exit market, capital's flowing there, it circulates, great ecosystem, love it. Here, a little bit more difficult. Is the answer you start to build here and then you go to the US or somewhere else and then look at exits over there? That could be one. Or could it just be we build out remotely? So there's certain things that can be built remotely. Obviously, the DeFi, the decentralized finance, fintechs, and also, I believe, life sciences.
Right.
So you can develop a vaccine, a therapeutic, a diagnostic tool in Singapore. You can run some pilots here. You can do trials elsewhere, and that's fine. You're still a Singaporean company, even if you do trials elsewhere, and that can then be sold off. So when you have a technology, a technology asset that is not tied to a physical location, I think that's very powerful. And that's one way to break free of in inverted commas, the tyranny of no exits in the region.
Interesting.
So that's the exit portion.
Right.
And then naturally that the prior will be funding. So we all know that funding situation is not ideal, shall we say. And where do you raise from? Who do you raise? What effects will it have on your company? And I think previously, startups now have gotten very smart, right? So, but previously, the previous generations of startups, my observation is they used to give out board seats like candy.
Yeah.
You know, almost every 100K investor gets a board seat. That's not ideal. That is not ideal. You need to maintain a good independent board that will support you strategically as well as tactically. And by the same notion, because startups founders have gotten very smart, because there's lots of programs, lots of accelerators, incubators, now everybody says, oh, I want to raise money, but only from strategic investors. You know, strategic investors. So clearly somebody's had a slide saying your investors must be strategic, right? And then the question comes, well, what do you mean by strategic? Do you mean they can help you on the piloting side, on the go-to-market side, the GTM side, on purely the marketing angle, or do their LPs, their limited partners within that fund, are they actually looking at some acquisitions? And sometimes they kind of go, strategic, you know, is the reply.
Define strategic.
So I think, absolutely. But I don't necessarily think you need to have an internal definition of strategic when you're looking at funding, but you must know what outcome you want to achieve with the funding, right?
What you actually need,
I mean,
what you are
sometimes, absolutely. And sometimes the right move may be taking that $50 million check, putting it in your pocket, not giving them any board seat, telling them, look, let me do my own thing. That may be the right move. On the other hand, taking a $1 million check, but somebody who's going to help you with GTM into 5 of global pharma may be the better option. So I think fundraising needs to be very purposeful. Why are you raising the funds? That should be a given because you need to articulate the purpose of the funding anyway. But what is the primary outcome that you really, really want to achieve? And is it the right outcome for the stage? So one of the big issues is sometimes some of these companies may say, oh, I need the links. I need a strategic investment so that I can get to pilots or I can get to GTM to this global pharma. But funding doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen over weeks. It's months to years, right? So sometimes by the time the funding comes in, they've actually have already done the pilot, right? And so I think sometimes doing a little bit of a timeline along with purposeful fundraising is going to be perhaps the next stage of evolution for some startups.
Thank you, Terence. Thank you, Vishal. Thank you all very much for watching this new episode of Entrepreneurs Insights on the Amplifiz podcast channel. Please give us some comments below, share, like, subscribe, of course, and see you soon. Thank you so much.